Tonight, someone will hand you a drink. Maybe it's a beer at the end of a long week. Maybe it's a glass of wine across a dinner table. You'll take a sip without thinking twice, but the real answer to where that habit came from is far stranger than a bar, a brewery, or a vineyard. It starts millions of years before any of those existed. It starts before humans existed at all. You assume alcohol is a human invention. It isn't. Long before your ancestors stood upright, before they used tools, before they even had language, the ancestors of primates were already encountering alcohol in the wild. Not in bottles, not in barrels, in fruit, overripe fruit, sitting on a forest floor, slowly fermenting in the heat. Here's what that means. When fruit falls from a tree and starts to rot, wild yeast breaks down its sugars. That process produces ethanol, the same molecule in your glass tonight. So for millions of years, primates foraging on forest floors were eating fruit that already contained small amounts of alcohol. It wasn't a treat, it was just food, slightly fermented food. A biologist named Robert Dudley at the University of California, Berkeley, spent years studying this. He proposed something called the drunken monkey hypothesis. His idea was simple, but it reshaped how scientists think about your relationship with alcohol. He argued that the smell of ethanol became a signal that ripe, calorie-dense fruit was nearby. Animals that could detect that smell and were drawn to it had an advantage. They found food faster. They ate more of it. They survived better. Do you see where this is going? The attraction to alcohol may not be a modern weakness. It may be an ancient survival tool, buried so deep in your biology that it predates humanity itself. Your body still carries the evidence. There's an enzyme called ADH4, alcohol dehydrogenase class 4, and it's responsible for breaking down ethanol in your gut and liver. Researchers studying primate genetics found something remarkable. About 10 million years ago, a single mutation appeared in the ancestor shared by humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. That mutation made the ADH4 enzyme 40 times more efficient at metabolizing ethanol. 40 times. Why would evolution favor that? Because around that same period, the ancestors of great apes shifted from living mostly in trees to spending more time on the forest floor. And the forest floor is where fallen, fermenting fruit collects. The mutation wasn't random luck. It was a response to an environment that was suddenly full of alcohol, and the animals that could process it efficiently thrived. So before humans lit a single fire, before anyone built a hut or planted a seed, the body you're using right now had already been shaped by alcohol. Millions of years of exposure written directly into your DNA. That's not a metaphor, that's biochemistry. Now, fast forward. Humans show up. Fire is tamed. Tools get sharper. Groups get larger. And somewhere in that long stretch of prehistory, something changes. Humans stop just eating fermented fruit by accident. They start making fermented drinks on purpose. When did that shift happen? For a long time, historians assumed it lined up with the rise of farming. The story went like this. Humans settled down, grew grain, learned to bake bread, and eventually figured out that leftover grain mash could ferment into beer. Agriculture first, alcohol second, neat and logical. But archaeology doesn't always agree with neat and logical stories. In 2018, archaeologists working in Rakifet Cave on the slopes of Mount Carmel in what is now Israel uncovered something that upended that timeline. The site belonged to the Natufian people, hunter-gatherers who lived roughly 13,000 years ago. That's before agriculture. Before farming, as we know, it existed anywhere in the region, inside stone mortars carved into the cave floor. Researchers led by Li Liu found residue. Not residue from grinding grain into flour. Residue consistent with brewing. Starch granules that showed the telltale damage patterns of malting, mashing, and fermentation. In other words, hunter-gatherers who had never planted a single crop appeared to be brewing something like beer. Stop and sit with that for a second. Beer, or something close to it, may have existed before bread did, before farming did, before permanent villages did. This gave rise to a competing theory researchers now call the beer before bread hypothesis. The idea is unsettling in the best way. What if humans didn't domesticate wild grains primarily to eat them as food? What if they domesticated grains, in part, because they wanted a reliable, repeatable source of alcohol? Why would that matter enough to reshape an entire way of life? Because alcohol, in small and controlled amounts, does something powerful to a group of humans sitting around a fire. It lowers inhibition, it encourages bonding, it makes storytelling looser, laughter easier, suspicion softer. For a species that survives through cooperation, alcohol may have functioned as social glue long before anyone understood the chemistry behind it. Anthropologists have a term for this. They call it the social lubricant hypothesis, and it isn't just a modern observation about happy hour. Some researchers argue it may have been one of the quiet engines behind the rise of larger, more complex human communities. Groups that could gather, drink together, and strengthen social bonds may have out-cooperated groups that couldn't. You felt a version of this yourself. Think about the last time you had one drink with someone you barely knew. Did the conversation get easier? Did the distance between you shrink just slightly? That feeling isn't random. It's a chemical response your ancestors may have been relying on for thousands of years to hold their communities together. Let's go further east and further back. At a site called Jiahu in China's Henan province, archaeologists uncovered pottery jars dating back roughly 9,000 years. A biomolecular archaeologist named Patrick McGovern from the University of Pennsylvania analyzed the residue inside them. What he found was a mixed fermented beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit. Not wine as you know it, not beer as you know it, something in between, brewed by people who were still transitioning from foraging toward farming. McGovern has spent decades chasing the earliest traces of alcohol across the globe. His research suggests that nearly every early civilization, independently, in different corners of the world, arrived at fermentation. China, the Fertile Crescent, later Mesoamerica, with fermented drinks made from agave and corn. Different continents, different ingredients, different eras, the same discovery made again and again. Doesn't that pattern feel important? When completely separate human populations with no contact with each other all stumble onto the same technology, it usually means that technology was solving a problem worth solving. What problem was it solving? Safety, for one. In many early settlements, fermented drinks were often safer to consume than untreated water. The fermentation process could kill certain pathogens. A weak beer, consumed daily, may have quietly protected communities from waterborne illness long before anyone understood germs existed. Nutrition, for another. Fermentation increases the availability of certain vitamins and can preserve calories in a form that lasts far longer than raw grain or fruit. In seasons of scarcity, a jar of fermented liquid could mean the difference between going hungry and getting through the winter. And then there's the piece that's harder to measure but just as real. Ritual. Across nearly every ancient culture archaeologists have studied, alcohol shows up not just at meals but at funerals, festivals, weddings, and religious ceremonies. Sumerian hymns praised beer as a gift from the gods. Egyptian tomb paintings show beer being brewed for the afterlife. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer wasn't a luxury. It was closer to a dietary staple, consumed daily by ordinary workers as part of their rations. Here's the twist that tends to surprise people the most. In many of these early societies, alcohol wasn't reserved for celebration. It was reserved for survival, and celebration came second. The idea of alcohol as an occasional indulgence, something for a Friday night, is actually a much more modern framing. For most of human history, in most places, it was closer to a food group. So think about what you actually inherited. Not just a taste for something fermented, not just an enzyme that helps your liver process it. You inherited a behavior that may have shaped how humans built trust, how they organized labor, how they marked the passage of seasons and the milestones of a life. There's a psychological layer to this too, and it connects directly back to that ancient enzyme. Because your body isn't just built to tolerate alcohol. In many ways, it's built to want it. The same reward pathways in your brain that once lit up when your distant primate ancestors sniffed out fermenting fruit on a forest floor are the same pathways that light up today when you catch the smell of a glass of wine or hear the pop of a bottle opening. The wiring is ancient, the trigger has just changed shape. Does that mean alcohol is simply hardwired and unavoidable? Not exactly. Culture shapes how that ancient wiring gets expressed. Some societies built entire rituals of moderation around alcohol, treating it as sacred and communal. Others treated it as medicine. Others, especially as distillation technology advanced, and alcohol became more concentrated and more accessible, struggled with the darker consequences of that same ancient drive. The pull is old, what you do with it is not fixed. Which brings up an interesting historical turning point. For most of human history, alcohol existed almost exclusively in fermented forms, beer and wine, with relatively low alcohol content by modern standards. Distillation, the process of concentrating alcohol into spirits like whiskey or vodka, is a much newer human invention, refined and spread widely only within roughly the last 1,000 years. That means for the overwhelming majority of the time your species has been drinking, the alcohol itself was weaker, and the drinking was slower, more communal, more woven into daily meals rather than separated from them. In other words, the modern shot glass and the modern rate of consumption are historical outliers. Your ancestors weren't drinking the way people often drink today. They were sipping something closer to a mildly fermented porridge or a weak beer, spread across an entire day, often alongside food, often surrounded by other people. Why does that distinction matter to you now? Because it reframes the entire conversation. Alcohol itself isn't new. Your relationship to it, the pace, the concentration, the isolation with which some people now consume it, that's the part that's changed. The biology is old, the context around it is not. Think back to the drunken monkey hypothesis for a moment. Robert Dudley's theory wasn't just about explaining a taste for fermented fruit. It was about explaining a pattern of attraction, a pull towards something that once meant survival. Somewhere along that evolutionary chain, a scent that once meant food is here became a scent that, for many people today, means something closer to relief is here or connection is here. The underlying wiring didn't disappear. It was repurposed, and that repurposing runs both directions. The same instinct that once helped a primate locate ripe, nutrient-rich fruit in a vast forest is the instinct that, in a very different context, can pull a person toward unhealthy patterns of drinking when that ancient reward system gets triggered too often, too intensely, without the natural limits that existed in the wild. Fermenting fruit on a forest floor only ever reaches a certain mild potency before it rots entirely. Modern alcohol has no such ceiling. That mismatch between an ancient reward system and a modern concentrated trigger is worth sitting with. So where does that leave you, standing there tonight with a drink in your hand? You're not doing something new. You're not even doing something uniquely human. You're participating in a behavior that stretches back past agriculture, past cities, past language itself, into the deep evolutionary past of primates foraging on forest floors for fruit just ripe enough to help them survive. The enzyme in your liver right now is the same one that appeared roughly 10 million years ago in a shared ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. The instinct pulling you toward that scent, that taste, that social ease is older than the species you belong to. The Natufians in that cave on Mount Carmel weren't so different from you. 13,000 years ago, before farming, before permanent homes, they were grinding grain in stone mortars, hoping to produce something worth gathering around. In Jiahu, 9,000 years ago, someone was mixing rice, honey, and fruit into jars, chasing the same result. Across oceans, across centuries, across completely disconnected civilizations, humans kept arriving at the same conclusion. Something fermented was worth the effort. Maybe that's the real answer to why you drink tonight, or why the people around you will. It isn't really about the taste, though the taste helps. It isn't really about the buzz, though that plays its part too. It's about 10 million years of biology quietly nudging you toward a fire, a table, a room full of other people, and something in a cup that has always, in one form or another, made it a little easier to sit close to each other and stay. Tonight someone will hand you a drink, and this time, when you take that sip without thinking twice, maybe you'll realize you were never really deciding on your own. 10 million years of evolution already made up your mind for you.